Today on Rebuilders, we are looking at one of the biggest news events of the last couple of weeks, the passing of Queen Elizabeth II and the royal funeral. But we aren't looking at it just to talk about it, but we are looking at it from more of a meta view.
Yeah, looking at it through, I think, the frameworks of this podcast and asking the question, moments of great public mourning like this over the loss of a head of state, a monarch, or even at times of a great, public tragedy, these moments are actually quite revealing. And so what does this reveal about our grey zone moment, but specifically the grey zone between religion and secularism?
Yeah, it's a great chat. We hope you enjoy it. If you want to know more about the resources that were referred to in this episode, you can sign up to our mailing list at rebuilders.co. Let's get into it. Welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. How are you both going?
I'm very good, thanks.
Yep, doing great over here, thank you.
Excellent.
Yep.
You and your almond croissant over there?
Mm-hmm. Yep, I'm living into the new land that we've landed in.
That was smooth.
Thank you. Pastryland.
Pastryland.
Yeah, Liddy's joined.
I
Welcome.
joined.
Mark
is in exile.
He's
I'm in exile. I didn't today. I may in the future. But you did mention that you noticed that, and this is actually not a joke, that last week when we reestablished pastries, that actually our numbers of listeners went up.
There is a portion of you out there who just listen for the pastry talk.
Yeah.
So bless you. We've got other good content as well you can stick around for.
That's why I'm not eating, because there are greater things than pastries.
Are there indeed?
But I did pick up the pastries this morning, and there was a gentleman there with his jacket at the cafe, jacket all like tucked in, lapel tucked in. And it was just one of those things. I was like, if that was me, I'd want someone to tell me that that's tucked in. And so I told him, and he fixed it.
Was he grateful?
He was, yeah. He said, thank you. He said, I was rushing out the door on my way to get a coffee, just chucked the jacket on. And so thank you, kind sir.
You are literally the fabric that holds together our society.
Just doing my part, Yeah, it's the little things.
Or you're untucking the fabric that holds together our society, either way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very nice. Well, good on you, Daniel, for your contribution to our local government area. So today we are talking about something that's been happening, that I guess has been present in the media worldwide for the last couple of weeks. What are we talking about?
We're going to talk about the Queen's passing, and obviously recognise the Queen as the head of state of Australia and many of the countries listening, New Zealand, Canada, UK, Caribbean nations. But what we want to talk about is there's obviously lots in the media about this and all kinds of debates, republicanism versus monarchism, colonialism, et cetera, et cetera. What we're just not going to do is not so much talk about those things in particular, but really what I want to talk about is the way in which the mourning period around the Queen's passing actually reveals something. Periods of mourning reveal something. And I want to talk about how we have a theme here of the idea of a grey zone, which is this in-between period between eras. But I want to take the term grey zone and actually say that periods of mourning actually can sometimes reveal that in our culture there's a grey zone between faith and religion and spirituality and secularism.
Interesting.
Often we talk about this very clear division between those who have faith and those who don't, religion and secularism, sacred, profane, and as if there's some sort of very clear border, like a line on a map. But it's really interesting that at periods like this, when there's sort of a communal sense of loss, that really challenges a sort of concept of how we think about belief and unbelief. And to talk about this, it's interesting to go back to a previous previous funeral associated with the royal family, and that's when Princess Diana, the former Princess of Wales, passed away in 1997 at the age of 36. She was obviously estranged somewhat from the royal family, and her marriage had fallen apart with Charles. She was dating Dodi Fayed at the time and was killed in a car accident in Paris in a tunnel. Fleeing from the paparazzi, getting across the city. And it was really interesting at that time because what happened was there was this almost organic outpouring of grief
Yeah.
all around the world, but particularly in Britain. And what you saw is almost these sort of spontaneous ways that the public responded to that moment.
Yeah.
One was the flowers that were placed at the front of Buckingham Palace and also Kensington Palace, which sort of just grew and grew. It was just huge amounts of flowers. I can't remember exactly how long before, but maybe a few weeks or a month or something before Princess Diana was killed in that car accident, she was seen comforting Elton John, the singer, at I think it was Gianni Versace's funeral.
Yeah.
Gianni Versace, the fashion director or fashion inventor of the Versace brand and fashion designer, was murdered, I think in Italy. And there was this very public scene of Princess Diana comforting Elton John. So then at Diana's funeral, it was this really interesting space where you had these elements that were sort of traditional, but then you also had these elements which were responding very much to the public's sort of outpouring of grief. And there's that famous line, I think it was in the interview with Martin Bashir, where Princess Diana said, he asked her, do you think you'll ever be queen? And she said, I don't know if I'll ever be queen, but I want to be the queen of hearts of the people. And so when she passed away, you had this organic response, but a number of people noted at the time, it was so huge, it like tapped into something bigger.
Yes.
So there's obviously the death of this public figure, but it tapped into something more significant. Now, one of the ways that some people looked at this, particularly from, I guess, some of the territory in which we explore on this podcast and sort of religion and culture, is that this was a manifestation of a term called implicit religion.
Okay.
Implicit religion comes from a vicar, an academic called Edward Bailey. And Edward Bailey was the vicar of an English parish. And so he's an Anglican minister. But before he was an Anglican minister, he also worked in a pub. And he noticed that in the pub, he worked about 400 hours and that there was very much, and obviously as a vicar in training or whatever, he understood liturgy and worship and all this sort of stuff. But he noticed that in some ways that the pub had its own forms of liturgy.
Yeah.
When someone walked in the door, heads would turn to face whoever walked in the door. There was sort of almost a hierarchy around how much you could hold your drink. There was certain things people said. The bartender was almost like a kind of priest handing out the sacrament of alcohol.
Yeah.
And, so he noticed that, hang on, there's almost this sort of sense of meaning. He said that in over 400 hours, there was only once ever when someone came in to drink because they were thirsty. And so he felt there was actually something more going on, that what the pub was doing was providing people with this sense of deeper meaning, and almost there was a kind of spirituality. So he sort of posited this idea of implicit religion, which is, it's almost a form of personal spirituality which is not articulated. Now, Peter Brearley, I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce his last name, but he's also written on implicit religion. And he says this, he says, implicit religion is internal. It is the religion of any person in the world and what she or he considers his or her religion to be. Now, this is interesting key points. It's emotional rather than logical, felt rather than reasoned. It's personal, not impersonal, and thus individualized, consistent with a postmodern world. Now, again, going back to the way we often talk about the rise of secularism, I recently saw some stats around America and people said, the religious nuns are rising and Christians are dropping and there's going to be some crossover point where America becomes this post-religious culture. But almost when you look at implicit religion, what you see is there's a much bigger grey zone, a sort of no man's land between the two sides of religion and irreligion. And in that space, this is some of the sort of sentiments around life after death. When someone who perhaps doesn't have religion and a grandmother dies, what do they tell their children? Granny's gone to be with the angels. You hear people talk at funerals in these particular ways that, that person's died, but they're gone on to be a star. They're watching us now. You could also look at the ways that things like UFOs, ghosts, belief in psychic abilities also are in this really interesting space between sort of belief and unbelief. So it's a much more grey zone space between these two things. So what happens then that when you have these moments of, say, communal mourning, which could be something like, the death of Princess Diana or even the death of the Queen. It can be at moments of existential threat. I think particularly in our country around natural disasters like bushfires, moments of war, conflict. You see this almost tension between the existential reality of people having an implicit religion and an implicit spirituality and how they deal with it in the personal. But then there comes this time where we've got to then live that out socially in a social space with others. So Princess Diana was an interesting example of that, where people were like, we've got to do something. It was very felt. And it had these pop culture elements, the Elton John song where he played at the funeral. I don't know if I said this earlier when it brought up Elton John, but the point of that, at the funeral, he then played Candle in the Wind, and I think it went to number one for ages, the song.
Yeah, I remember that.
Goodbye England's Rose, he changed the words of it. So it was this that was like your implicit religion. If you think about it, it's sort of a pop song is very romantic, and there's sort of this love sort of concept, but also this sort of therapeutic, individualized sense around it. So it was almost like at that moment, what Elton John had done was provide a communal focus point for that implicit religion that so many people felt, or the putting of flowers somewhere. Another example would be, I saw quite disturbing footage the other day of, I saw online of after 9/11 in New York, I think it was at Radio City Hall, they had a concert of playing John Lennon songs. It was disturbing because Kevin Spacey was leading, and he was like the MC for the night, and he ended up singing the John Lennon song "Mind Games," which is very bizarre and disturbing. His allegations in Me Too and all that. But what do we do? These things happen to our city. Oh, we need to do something.
Yes.
And let's have John Lennon, Imagine. The song Imagine is a classic sort of epitome of this sort of implicit religion concept. Okay, so that's implicit religion. Does that resonate? Am I capturing that? Do you guys get the sense of what that is covering?
I think so. I think what your explanation reminds me of is where we've talked before about, everyone has something that they're worshipping. So if it's not God, then what is it? Who is it? Where is it? The self? Is it whatever? But in times of tragedy, people don't know where to turn or how to process it.
Yes.
So you have this emergence of implicit religion to deal with it or to process it.
Yes.
It also makes me think of sport. I mean, we're coming up to the AFL Grand Final here in Melbourne, and I remember someone saying to me that is their religion. Back when I was teaching, I was chatting with a colleague about how I attended church and what that looked like for me, and he's like, "Oh yeah, sport's my religion."
Yeah.
That's what I believe in and I live for. And I'm like, wow.
And even people who've studied implicit religion talk about sport. You think about, we've got our big Australian rules grand final coming up, and there is a whole liturgy. From the national anthem, they always get a celebrity out to sing. It's a whole day. And even I caught the train in the city, and I went past the Melbourne Cricket Ground on Monday, and they're already been setting up for almost weeks. All the sort of tents around it. And there'll be people pilgrimaging in from around Australia for that.
Yeah.
But even they talk about with sport, the idea of like, in Australia particularly, getting kids into sport. Sport is almost this catechism, this discipleship, this formation into particular values. You you look and say, in soccer, people singing in unison, and even the way that, like at the FA Cup final, they sing "Abide with Me," which is a hymn. But even some of the football songs are like repurposed hymns and songs and stuff like that. Really interesting.
And also on the point about a pub is what? How did you describe it? As a
like a liturgy?
Yeah, that there's a liturgy. It kind of goes back to what you were talking about last week with institutions and how every institution has its traditions and its forms that people ascribe to and carry on to be a part of this institution. And so equally with this implicit religion. There are those practices that form it, and people drawn to the institution of whatever that religion is. Yeah.
I mean, just to return to that definition there, and one way of understanding institution is a repeated pattern that you do that has some kind of meaning or sacredness to it. That is aimed at a future flourishing. So the pub might be that sense of community. The sporting, getting a kid into hockey is like, well, we've always done this, and this builds good character and teamwork and discipline and fitness towards that end. You have, sport, all these things. So this is where you realize that the lines between institutions, orders, practices, religion, it's all very blurred.
Yes.
It's all in the sort of grey zone. Now, what's interesting is, so that was 1997, the implicit religion that really came to the fore during the sort of mourning that happened around Princess Diana. Then when you have the Queen, in many ways it sort of triggers those memories. That's the nearest. The Queen, Britain's not had the death of a monarch for a very long time. Australia has not had one either. Also as the Queen is our head of state for a long time.
Yes.
So you haven't got a sort of lived memory of what that looks like since, was it when she came to when her father died. So it's interesting that almost you saw some of those forms begin to take hold of different ways that people were sort of responding, and we'll talk about this in a second, but very different ways in different in Britain compared to, I would say, even some of the Commonwealth realms and stuff like that, and so on. Because in some ways, you could argue the Queen was the most famous person in the world. So even in countries that weren't former Commonwealth realms, you had this almost idea of celebrity or this well-known person and so on. But what's really interesting is you watched and I think, Daniel, you didn't watch the funeral, but Lydia and I both watched. Actually, I think you were babysitting for Daniel.
I was.
Melody.
I was.
Thank you. So you
I watched
actually
on your television.
Yes. Where were you guys? You were out.
Just catching up with some old friends.
There you go. Yeah. Lovely. You had that expectation, and having seen the funeral of Diana, and then like the sort of day, this day, I went for 9 hours. I
didn't watch it all.
Yeah, I didn't watch it because at the time I watched the first part of the funeral, and then when they sort of handed the coffin over to the hearse, I went to bed. But
Same.
What struck me was, it started, and they had the coverage here on the Australian, it was on all the channels, and they were talking, you were waiting for the service to begin, and they were, it's Justin Trudeau, and there's all these different people coming in, and sort of like there's the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, and so it was a little bit celebrity sort of vibe as everyone was sort of filing into the church, and obviously the Meghan Markle thing and all that, they're sort of following that. And then it was like the service began, and it was just like full pelt sort of civil religion, high church, sort of moment. And it was almost, people talked about it was like jarring, it was like they had the cross they were marching in, and all the royal orb and scepter and the liturgy and the songs and the choir. So it was almost like it was really different in some ways to Diana's funeral. And what it was, this is not implicit religion. This is very much civil religion, and it's this concept that of the constitutional monarchy, Queen is the defender of faith and sort of head of the Anglican Church, and you had different members of the Presbyterian Church speaking and so on, and you realize like, no, this is the whole thing of the fabric of Britain and looking out into the Commonwealth. And so often you then have these very established civil religion forms. In America, you might see this if you go to a place like Washington. You see these different Congress and these buildings, and you see the flags, and there's this sense of civil religion where it's less organic, it's more communal than sort of the implicit religion. And in some ways, if you can think about it, in some ways, implicit religion and civil religion is actually this, in some ways you could look at it, it's like in the 18th century awakenings, you had this sort of tension where you had people who were sort of following high Anglicanism, and then you had the enthusiasts, like people like John Wesley, and some of the complaints made at John Wesley is like, you're dealing with this sort of very felt real faith in your private life. You shouldn't be doing that, versus here's what we all do in public. Do what you want in your private life, but there's this tension between the public and private. But I think what we're seeing is this sense that at this moment that there is this crisis that's happening to secularism, the story we've told ourselves. And so I think in some ways what's happened as the Queen has passed, it's revealed all these things that were already in tension and sort of this grey zone between religion, unbelief. All of it is sort of coming to the surface. And what I began to wonder is, we've talked before about civilizational states and the concept that you have these nations like China, Russia, India, which are going in a very different direction to the concept of, say, the liberal multicultural West, where what they're saying is we're going to build a society all around, a particular form of often religion, as in India, Hinduism, ethnicity, which China's doing with, Han ethnicity, in Russia with this sense of history and Russianness, and saying we're actually going to build an identity as a state or even as a civilization around these particular things. Now, Christopher Coker, in his book on the civilizational state, says civilizational states are primarily things which non-Western leaders are doing in contrast to the liberal democracies of the West. But I've just been wondering in the last sort of week or two, as I've watched the Queen's sort of period of mourning, that you see some people who are like, hang on, this is revealing that we need this stuff. We need the monarchy. We need these symbols, and maybe they're not perfect, but they're this continuity to history, and there actually are these Christian roots to it. And this is a constitutional democracy. And in Australia, as in New Zealand, as in many of the Caribbean nations, as in Canada, there's conversations about republic. Should we have a republic? Should we have a constitutional monarchy? It's interesting. I noticed that the Age newspaper here in Melbourne published the latest polls, and actually support for a republic has gone down. And
really?
The republic would lose in every state barring ours, Victoria. Shock horror. So you're seeing this period of mourning where people are looking at the monarchy. This is actually something we need. We need this bigger story. And you saw we had a number of people write us messages about this, but like people lining up for 13 hours to view the Queen's body, and people saying it's like a pilgrimage. It's like something they wanted to do. And even I've heard people here in Melbourne like, if I was there, I would have gone. And people actually flew over from Australia to go and do this. So you've got that one side of it, like, hang on, this is something which we've lost. We need to recapture this. But then you've got this other conversation as well of, hang on, this is connected to a whole different story. There was issues of empire and colonialism and what does that mean? And if we're going to go back into history, we also need to deal with that. And who do we want to be post this? And you're seeing, interestingly, there was a sort of meme online of the Queen's crown and the scepter and the orb and all the different jewels and stuff, which was actually taken from various colonies, Australia and South Africa and India. And online you had, Indians demanding, I think it's the ruby back. And, but all of this is, in a sense, then starts to ask the question, what do we want to be collectively?
Yes.
And I think the tensions in the sort of liberal democratic state, which has tried to be secular, which is like, you do your own thing, believe what you want to believe. The basic minimum of belonging is you've got a passport and you've got a social security number. All of a sudden for everyone, what the Queen's period of mourning has done is like, hang on, there is bigger things that humans desire, meaning, story, identity. It's all at play in there. So in a sense, I began to wonder, I'm not going to say here that the West is becoming a civilizational state, but I'm almost wondering now if something is happening that is like a flirting with the civilizational state.
So are you suggesting that – so you've kind of said two things, that the West is now challenged with this idea of seeking out what their corporate identity is.
Yes.
But at the same time questioning whether they want a corporate identity or they want separate ones.
Yes.
Is that kind of what,
and maybe wanting both. Like so for example, like I think what is falling down – Now is a kind of, again, if we're in a grey zone, we're moving out of a previous era.
Yes.
Now, as I watched the funeral, something struck me. There was a bit where, around when I went to bed, which was when they'd walked with the carriage, the gun carriage, with the Queen's coffin, and there was a bunch of soldiers, I think sailors, and they walked through the streets of London, and they walked past Buckingham Palace, and I think they got up to Green Park, and they were transferring it to the hearse. So you could see all the sort of trees of Green Park, and you could see, there's obviously Buckingham Palace is near there, and you got Kensington Palace, and on the other side, all this sort of stuff. So you got the sort of symbols of the royalty, the palaces.
Yeah.
Now, where they'd also just come from is Westminster, where you've got the symbols of Parliament.
Yes.
Now, the symbols of Parliament and the symbols of the palace went to war in the 17th century.
Yeah, right.
You had the English Civil War, where the forces of Parliament then basically went to battle against the king, and you had Charles I actually was executed by the forces of Parliament, and Oliver Cromwell became the sort of was it Lord Protector or whatever of Britain. So Britain was a republic for a period there. So two forces, Parliament versus royalty. But as you're looking at Green Park, and the view that they had on our coverage was you could see behind the City of London. Now, there's the City of London, as most people understand it, but when people say the City of London, that's also sort of shorthand for the financial centre of London. So there's a third power in London. There's the royal power, there's the parliamentary power, and then there is the City of London, which if you go back in history, has really, in many ways, could be argued as the seedbed of global capitalism. You could argue it's the seedbed of the vision of the world as we understand it now through mercantilism and finance and cross borders. And in many ways, you could even argue that empire doesn't so much go back to Parliament and the royalty as you could argue that with entities like the East India Company, which was this first, in a sense, global corporation that went across the world and sort of colonized parts of India, and they had their own army. They had literally a corporate army, the East India Company army. So in some ways, maybe that was the civilizational state we were living under before.
Right.
But it didn't have a name. Susan Strange was, I think, a political scientist. And she had this interesting concept about a civilizational state that we were under. This is Christopher Corker talking about Susan Strange. But he says this. He says, Susan Strange wrote an article about what she chose to call business civilization, a term she coined to describe an informal grouping of transnational corporations, business school graduates, and international agencies such as the World Trade Organization. It constituted something new, a globalized community of bankers and financiers who spent their time cooling their heels in airport lounges, business lounges, or attending meetings of the World Economic Forum at Davos. So she's saying there that, in a sense, the history of that comes out of the City of London, the financial centre of London, goes across the world. And this has been the dominant thing since 1989, since communism fell. And you see the rise of this globalised world, this sort of think about popular culture, think about social media, think about fashion, all hugely determined by the wants and needs of this sort of global business civilization that she's speaking about. Even the way that people look at their lives. What's self-help? Well, it's sort of productivity, the entrepreneur as a figure of sort of, almost the cultural aspiration that you can be. The sort of concept of individualism, of experientialism, of consumerism. And in a sense, I began to wonder that any sort of form of government that has a power, it has a social contract with the people. So, for example, social contract theory is that you give up some of your freedom so the state will provide security and provide you with things.
Yeah.
Now, when social contracts fall, that's often when you have revolutions. Now, we've had an implicit social contract with business civilization.
Yes.
That, all right, we'll give up our freedom. We'll say goodbye to the big stories. We'll say goodbye to the bigger, almost religious narratives and things of our life, and even community and relationship if you keep delivering us stuff. But now as the world sort of comes to this, in a sense, a crisis of business civilization, crisis of globalization, crisis of, cost of living and inflation, and we're looking ahead and people can't afford a house and people are wondering if in 10 years we're going to be worse off than we were 10 years ago, that the implicit social contract that business civilization has with us is failing. So people are looking for something more. There was an interesting article in Reuters this week which said that Chinese young adults are now basically moving into simple living and they're spending less and they're creating this new way of living. And I think that's happening, that part of our whole model of business civilization was that people would the economy would continue to grow, your opportunities would continue to grow, your experiences would grow. When that stops, a crisis is created. So this is why I think that we're now beginning to perhaps turn a gazing eye back to other civilizational forms as the West.
So you're also suggesting that that civilizational states or this flirtation is taking numerous forms.
Yes.
What do you mean?
Okay, so one could be, as we've seen in this like royal mourning, where in Britain there's this question of what it is to be. That's going all throughout the Commonwealth now. What are we? Should we cling to the past and tradition? And even online, there was sort of like talks that Prince Charles had spoken about. Tradition versus modernity, and him arguing for tradition, and people like, oh, this is amazing, check this out, call him the based king and all this sort of stuff. But then you look at other things like the freedom movement, which sort of came out of, I guess, some of the reactions to various lockdowns and pandemics, where you saw people marching through Melbourne with American flags and Union Jacks and Australian flags and New Zealand flags. You've seen that in Canada, this sort of almost wanting to turn to the West as an identity. So it's not the Commonwealth royal thing. It's sort of turning to the West and the West's sort of legacy of liberty and freedom. That's almost the sort of kind of civil religion that you've seen, or implicit religion that you've seen. You could argue that the US culture war is actually a war over what kind of civilizational state are we going to be? Are we going to turn back to this sort of more MAGA, Christian nationalist or economic nationalist populist sort of model that you see, Steve Bannon talking about? Or is it you could argue that sort of the woke thing is almost its own sort of civilizational state. It has its own flags, its own idea of the human self. It has this idea of vision and a vision of justice, and it's translocational. You see people who identify with that more than they would identify with their own sort of national identity or local identity, dress the same, act the same opinions is really interesting. And then you see this almost really interesting, I think, in many of the Commonwealth states, as they question. When I grew up, in every government building in my school, there was a picture of the Queen. You would see that in my primary school. You'd see that when you go to the local town hall. You'd see that in the local returned servicemen and servicewomen's leagues buildings, sporting clubs. But it's interesting how you've seen a slow changing where increasingly that sort of public imagery that often is a part of, say, civil religion is being replaced now by much more Indigenous forms. That when I was in New Zealand recently, I just noticed how, since I haven't been there since the pandemic, but you hear more Māori spoken by people who aren't Māori. Like you see more forms that are coming into the public space. And you're seeing that in Australia more. And on the news now, they have the English names and the Indigenous language names. And so even I noticed a book, like there's books coming out like sort of almost Indigenous wisdom as sort of self-help, or in how Indigenous thinking can help in business. So in some ways, there's almost this sort of post-colonial form where we need something. We can't have an identity which is purely business culture. We don't want to be Britain. We don't want to be the colonial thing. Can actually sort of Indigenous culture be a resource for us to find an identity, which is really interesting because that's sort of been rejected by liberal democracy in the past and multiculturalism, which didn't want to elevate one particular ethnicity or culture. But I think in this moment, as they're sort of looking across, it's like we need to replace this content-free vision with something.
Yeah. I think what I find interesting about these numerous forms is some, and you've acknowledged, some are translocational. So you've got people who don't necessarily identify with the land in which they live, but identify more with a people group. But then you've also still got the land and the nation trying to establish a meaning collectively. And how do you do that when you have such a variety of disparate views of what it means to find identity? So
this is the tension that the English political writer David Goodhart, what a lovely name.
Goodhart.
There's a Goodhart. David Goodhart brings out in his book where he talks about, I've forgotten the title of the book, but he talks about the anywheres and the somewheres. The somewheres are people who are defined by a particular place, a land. They're defined by a community. That's what their identity is connected to. And then the anywheres. The anywheres are the sort of international business collective, business civilization who can move. So definitely we see those tensions. It's interesting, Thomas Friedman also wrote a book, I think it was called The Lexus and the Olive Tree. Similar concept. There were the people who just wanted the olive tree that their ancestors had had for hundreds of years. You know, that was what was valued to them. Again, piece of land, history, people. And then the people who, no, they just want a Lexus. So I think you're right. That tension between those two things is evident everywhere in the world at this time.
So what are you seeing? How is this flirtation putting pressure on secular modernity?
There's a couple of ways that you're just seeing what I think these are, again, too, I'm not saying secular modernity is falling over, but there's definitely some pressures coming against it. So one is our focus is turning backwards. Modernity is all about the future. It's about shaping the future. Science fiction, a bright future. But what we're seeing is this looking backwards increasingly in the West. On one hand, you've got this sort of people who are like, let's have a conservative return to tradition. There was some little videos of Charles III, King Charles now, basically talking about the importance of tradition over modernity, and these young internet guys like, oh, this is amazing. So this look at the monarchy, this is what we need, at times like this when everything's up in the air. On the left, you've got an increasing conversation around, post-colonialism, and the Queen's mourning raises those questions, which again, though, is a looking backwards.
Yes.
And so, looking back to the past, dealing with the wrongs of the past. And it's in really stark contrast to what's happening in Asia. I recently I've got a little phone that I've got a little phone.
Yeah.
It's tiny.
It's
tiny. It's
phone.
too small to dial. An app on my phone called Feedly, where I just read all these newspapers around the world, and there was all these different Asian newspapers came up. And what struck me, in contrast to the West, it was all about crypto, virtual reality, EVs, future. And I've read research which says Asian young people are much more future focused now in Asia than people in the West, and it's really interesting how that sort of view is looking backwards. Just one other. So the modernity is face forward. We're increasingly looking backwards. So that's one way in which the story of an inevitable secular future, a bright, shiny utopia, that's starting to falter as we're more dealing with the problems of the past and what we can get from the past.
Yeah, okay.
Just one other thing, I don't even know how to describe this, but it struck me, a phenomenon. I took my boys to the museum this week, and it was just a fascinating dynamic that I saw in the museum. On the second level of the Melbourne Museum, there's a whole section called The Body and Evolution. So again, to museums, the history of them, very much an Enlightenment sort of institution.
Yeah.
I think about the history of Natural History Museum in London, which is almost like a temple, and it's interesting that the sort of you walk in and then they've sort of got on this elevated bit, sitting almost in this throne like an idol is Charles Darwin. Fascinating.
Oh wow.
So it's almost like this temple to sort of empirical thinking and reason and scientific inquiry. So that's very much the sort of vibe of the second level of the Melbourne Museum, and how the body and tells the story of evolution. But then on the first floor, there's quite a good sort of First Nations, First Peoples section telling the Indigenous history of our state of Victoria and of Melbourne, and of the Kulin Nation and Wurundjeri people. And as you're walking through, a lot of it is about creation stories, Indigenous creation stories. And what I noticed is interesting, understandably, the way it's not pitched now is it's not pitched as, here's what the myths of these people in sort of a very objectified, distant sense. It's, the creation myths, or our creation myths, because it's actually written in the voice of the First Nations people of our state and city. But I just thought, this is fascinating. You've got two different things happening on two different levels. On one level, you've got the sort of objective, presented, modern Enlightenment fact of evolution. But then on the first thing, there's this desire to have the voice of the first inhabitants of the land here tell the creation story. But again, it unintentionally creates a tension. Because those two stories tell two different things.
Yes.
And, traditionally, like what modernity has done, and Leslie Newbigin talked about this, is it talks about the fact that, there are objective truths and then there are values.
Yeah.
And I think out of respect for Indigenous people, Melbourne Museums has wanted the Indigenous people to speak in their voice, which I think is a really healthy thing. But is that then a value, that story?
Yeah.
Is it a competing story? Is this a relativist thing? I don't think it's presented in those ways at all, but there's a natural contradiction in these two things.
Yes.
And I do wonder, could you see in the future, people looking to stories of place and creation? And so for me, it was, I think if you took someone from the 1960s or 70s and you walked them through the Melbourne Museum, they'd be really, a scientist, they'd be really surprised to see the way that the creation stories are framed in that First Nations thing, First Nations exhibition. It's just. Are you guys getting? I haven't been able to put it into words, but it's a fascinating conundrum.
Well, it's kind of if you didn't know anything about the first peoples here in Australia, you didn't know about evolution of the world, like the evolutionary theory, and you walked into that museum, you're presented with two different.
Yes.
Almost competing narratives
on how the world has come to be.
Hang on, which one am I meant to be listening to or adhering to? And so I feel like that would be a natural tension.
And I think the thing that I found interesting as well was perhaps in the 90s it'd be like, oh, here's different stories, man, believe which one you want. Yeah. But because there's an understandable desire to honour the knowledge and stories and tradition and culture of Indigenous people, it's not presented as a value. It's not presented as just an alternate story to believe, man. So, but if the objective truth of enlightenment is that the evolutionary story is the dominant one, it actually means that the story on the first floor is wrong and just a myth. So no one wants to say that now because that would be seen as exclusionary. So there's an actual massive tension in the heart of the Melbourne Museum, which I think is representative of a tension of where the West as a society is at.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of understanding this tension within the confines of an institution or a building.
Grey Zone Museum.
Yeah, the Museum of the Grey Zone. We're talking about how this flirtation with civilizational states is putting pressure on secular modernity. But how about the opposite? How is secular modernity potentially fighting against civilizational states or the building of that?
Well, just look at China. China is attempting to build a civilizational state, but it has to have a great firewall of China to keep out influences on the internet. Xi is pushing back on what he sees as the individualism that is created by luxury brands and a market economy. He's changing the economy, but then in order to keep his social contract, the Chinese sort of Politburo has predicted they need to keep making a 5% growth in their GDP every year, which is pretty optimistic. Yeah. They're not meeting that at this point in time. Will Xi's power continue if he can't deliver people a good economy? So that just shows even when you're building a civilizational state, you're still under tremendous pressure. Look at Russia's attempt to push its civilizational state into Ukraine and the defeats they've experienced in the last few weeks in the war. Individualism, the market, the internet, the free exchange of ideas still comes, the civilizational states are being built in a digital global network.
Yes.
That's what's different to if you're building the Ottoman Empire, 400 years ago or something. So that's where, yes, the secular West, which tries to be content-free, is experiencing this pressure in one direction, but then also those who are trying to be civilizational states that are rich with content and narrative and story and symbolism and sacredness also feel a pressure. So again, this is what's driving our grey zone moment.
So ultimately, if I were to boil it down to a line, you're saying that really the mask or masks of secularism are off. We're seeing it for what it is perhaps, or more questioning what it has been.
Yes. I mean, I think from our perspective, from a biblical perspective, we're not going to give you an answer now of should we have a monarchy or a republic or any of that stuff. Leave that for the listener to discern if you were from a
Commonwealth nation.
A Commonwealth nation or a constitutional monarchy. But I think that what we need to realize is we go back to what we spoke about last week, that humans build orders of repeated patterns, and we do things together. We're social creatures. We build patterns. We want those patterns to have sacredness and meaning. We tell stories around those patterns. Why? Because we go back to Genesis, 1:28, 1:26, where it talks about the fact that God gives the human the command to, it's 1:28, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over every other living creature that moves on the ground. Humans will always build. Humans will always pursue some kind of flourishing. They will always fill the earth and subdue it. And so everything that humans do is religiously tinged, whether it's pointed towards God or not. Everything is a form of worship. Attention is worship, said the poet Mary Oliver. So everything that we do is worship. If you have a monarchy, in a sense, that becomes sort of a symbol, if you like, of the king of heaven. If you don't have a monarchy, you're going to create another king somewhere. That's not an argument for it to have a king or not. I think C.S. Lewis had a great quote that if you don't have a king, you'll just end up creating celebrities as kings, And when America was founded, one of the big conversations they had, Thomas Jefferson discussed, should we call the president their majesty, because they didn't had to not do a king sort of thing. So that's, again, I'm not making that as an argument for or against republic or monarchy. What I'm saying is humans seek meaning. Humans' hearts are constantly restless until they find their home in God. We're always going to build stuff. There is no secular, neutral position to stand in the world. We're constantly building meaning. And I think we're at a really strategic point evangelistically, missiologically, because many of the structures of meaning and order that we've built are now being shown up for their contradictions and their weakness. So I think this is actually not a moment where the church needs to be sort of afraid because maybe we're seeing an order falling or we're fearing the rise of secularism. I actually think secularism, I think the story, particularly in the West and developing countries that we're told, is looking particularly weak at the moment. I think we're going to see more of that. Grey zone is when everything's up in the air, but it's also an absolute opportunity-rich environment.
Great. If there is one thing, if there's one thing to take away, I mean, you've ended on that, the point of it being a evangelistically rich environment. But if there's one thing to take away for like a local church context and leading people in that space, what advice would you give? What perspective can leaders take on to help navigate or help others navigate this sort of grey zone space of understanding that distinction between religion and secularism?
I think that one thing that we're trying to do on here is to teach people missiology, to use the term.
Yeah.
And, we've talked about people like Leslie Newbegin who saw that, he was at a conference and it was with different Christians from across the world. And there was a Western speaker speaking. And he was sitting next to maybe someone from the Philippines. I can't remember what country it was. It was a non-Western country. And he heard, as this Western person was talking about the West and talking about Christianity, this brother in Christ next to him who was not from the West whispered under their breath in frustration, like, the real question is, can the West be converted? Yeah. And so there is the question that we are leading people in a form of discipleship. We're equipping them with a discernment as to understand that we need to be formed in the way of Jesus. John Tyson, who we've had on here before, a friend, he sort of describes his discipleship process as counterformation.
Yeah.
And in a sense, we're counterforming people to the ways of the world, which are no longer going to be one thing. They're going to be legion.
Yes. Yeah.
And contradictory and all contested and fighting against each other. We, in the midst of this, are forming people in the way of Jesus, and we're getting them to do that with the lens of what in culture is helpful, what is neutral, what is unhelpful.
Yeah.
And that's the task in this next season. We've talked about capacities here. We've talked about discipleship capacity and congregational capacity and stuff like that in the past. Where this leads us to is discernment capacity. And I think the ability of our churches to, form our people in the ways of Jesus, because in a grey zone moment like this, there's plenty of temptations to head down alternate paths, which are not the way of Jesus, but also to embrace the evangelistic opportunity of this moment, there is so much up in the air at the moment. And I think the myth that everyone's just secular out there and not asking questions is a false one. People are asking questions. I said it before, I think it was the George Hunter quote, look for the gaps between idols. That's where the evangelistic opportunities are. So that's what I would say.
Great. That's super encouraging. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, Daniel. Just a reminder, if you are listening and you're like, wow, there's a whole host of resources that have been referred to and you want to know what they are, you can subscribe to our mailing list and we'll let you know there. You can head to rebuilders.co and sign up there. We'll catch you next time.